Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If I can just do the safety announcement first, or the air hostess or steward. There are emergency exits through there and through the main door that you came in through. And if anyone needs a toilet, they're through that door over there. So, good evening and welcome to the Friends of Bucks Historic Church's annual lecture. The Friends organisation is here to help promote the work of Buckinghamshire's Historic Churches Trust and to help raise funds for the Trust. For those of you who do not know what the Trust does, it gives grants to historic churches and chapels across the whole of the county of Buckinghamshire to help maintain their buildings, so a very worthy cause. The Friends helps this by typically holding 3 events each year. Firstly, we have a visit to an interesting venue, not always in Buckinghamshire. Secondly, a church crawl around 3 churches with a specialist guide. And thirdly, an annual lecture, which is why we're all here tonight. The Friends also get early notification of the Trust's summer reception in a stately house somewhere in Buckinghamshire. The Friends was formed 18 years ago by my wife Marilyn and I, along with David Peck, who was serving the wine at the back tonight. And we built up a membership to just over 200 people in the 18 years. And if you're not already a friend, may I encourage you to become one. There are leaflets in the church, or you can go online to do so. But it's now time to hand the baton of running the Friends onto some new people. It's my wife Marilyn, who is our chairman, died in July, and our treasurer Chris, who is unable to be with us tonight, but I think he's listening online, has been in and out of the JR recently, but is now back home. So if you'd like to consider helping out, then I would be delighted to talk to you in more detail after the talk. So come and have a chat if you think you could help us pick up that baton. That was the advertising plug. Now I'd like to introduce the very new Bishop of Buckingham, the Right Reverend Dave Bull, who is also a trustee of the Trust, who is going to give us our annual lecture on the intriguing topic of church buildings and the presence of God. And after his talk, he'll be happy to take questions. So we can save the questions for the end, please. Dave.
Thank you, Nick. Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you. I was first ordained as a priest in 2008, and almost immediately people started to send me postcards with church buildings on them. That had never happened for the whole of my life, and suddenly, because I was ordained in the Church of England, everyone who went on holiday and went into a church picked up a postcard and seemed to send it to me. But regrettably, this hasn't resulted in me becoming an expert in church architecture. So much so that when I was first approached for this evening, I wondered if they'd sent it to the wrong person. I don't know. I don't think I'm an expert in anything, actually. I'm certainly not an expert in church architecture. But I do love churches and the communities that meet in them. And just as well, given my new occupation as Bishop of Buckingham since February of this year. So I'm going to be speaking this evening about the interplay, I suppose, with the story of God's presence as we read it in the Bible, and the development of buildings associated with that on the other hand. So I hope you find it interesting, intriguing. Apologies if you know some of it or even most of it already, but there is a quiz in the middle where I've got photos of different parts of churches in Buckinghamshire. And there's no prize, I should add, for the competitive amongst you. But even if it helps you stay awake halfway through, there'll be a chance for you to see if you can recognise certain parts of historic churches in Bucks. Now, I don't know if you can, how well you can read the, can any of you read that? And can you hear me okay? Yeah. Even if you're at the back? Good. Well, a bit louder. I will speak a bit more loudly. Thank you. So, an exploration of the relationship between God, buildings, worship, and people. Here are some of the things we're going to be thinking about. What were the first buildings ever constructed for worship? Why were they built? How were they used? What did worship in them look like? And how are they, from thousands of years ago, related to our churches today? And what lessons can we learn for our own churches? I'm going to start with a very quick whiz through the Bible, thinking about the theme of God's presence. I believe one of the ways you can read the Bible, there's an infinite number, but one of the ways you can read the Bible is to see it as a story about God's own presence. Let me explain. I'm going to take you through the whole Bible in about 90 seconds. In the beginning, in the Garden of Eden, human beings walked with God, and his presence was as clear to them as your presence is to the person sitting next to you. But then something went dramatically wrong, and the people were banished from the garden and from God's presence forever, or so it seemed. Until God called a man called Abraham and revealed himself in fire and in mysterious voices that called Abraham to leave the place where he'd grown up and to travel to somewhere else, to the land of Canaan. Later in the story, God's people had been taken down, if you remember the story of Joseph, he of the Technicolor Dreamcoat, to Egypt. And they were then brought back to the land that Abraham had moved to by an extraordinary revelation we'll come back to later of God's presence on Mount Sinai. They then moved into the promised land where they were promised they would be able to dwell with God and enjoy his presence. And they built there a temple in which they could worship God and where God's presence would be geographically situated. But they didn't live there for all that long because of their disobedience and of their turning away of God. They were exiled to Babylon. And first the Assyrian Empire and then the Babylonian Empire swept through the Levant and kicked them out. And they mourned the loss of God's presence. 400 years went by, and then someone arrived who changed the story completely. Jesus was born, and it was said of him that he brought God's presence in a human form. He was baptized, if you know the story. A dove appeared to rest on Jesus as a sign of God's presence descending from above. Jesus himself did extraordinary miracles that some said were caused by God's presence somehow emanating from him. And when Jesus died on the cross, it was assumed that God's presence, as manifested in this one human life, had disappeared forever. But the story of the resurrection is of God's presence, stronger than death, returning. And on Jesus' ascension, the presence of God was poured out the day of Pentecost. I'll explain some of this a bit more later. But God's presence then appeared to all of those who would receive it. And the mission of the church was to take this presence of God all the way around the world until at the end of time, Jesus would reappear and we would all go to heaven to live in God's presence forever, if you like looping back to the start of the story. That was slightly more than 90 seconds, but I'm trying to show you how one can interpret the whole of the biblical narrative in terms of God's presence. And this is one of our key themes that we'll be thinking about this evening. Is anyone still awake? One or two. I'm encouraged. So, this theme of God's presence, which remember, if you go back to, say, Mount Sinai, if you know the story, the Israelites camped around this mountain and there were peals of thunder and lightning, and Moses ventured up the mountain in fear and trembling and met with God. And so the idea of God's presence, which might to us seem a little bit like, I don't know, a will-o'-the-wisp that sort of might appear or disappear, this ephemeral thing, it was not like that. Now, the presence of God for these ancient Israelites was something a little bit like having a nuclear reactor in your kitchen. Can you imagine that for a moment? Imagine something so powerful, so dangerous, that you have to handle it very carefully. And these are the tribes of Israel, camped by Mount Sinai I love this picture because it's just the mushroom cloud coming out of the very center of the campsite. I'm trying to evoke some idea of what the first worship involved. It involved human beings, tiny little ants like us, coming into the presence of a God who was so mighty and powerful that he was described in terms of thunder and lightning and earthquakes. It was a sobering, even a terrifying thing to worship. Not sure how many people would say that if they wander into a church in North Bucks, creak open the door, and feel as if they're entering into God's presence. We don't think of it like that now, but 4,000 years ago, that's exactly how the ancient Israelites thought. And so they had to find a way of containing this presence, of safely handling it, of having a God like this living in their midst. And this is where we find the very first construction project that the church commissioned, or God's people commissioned. This is what was spoken to Moses. Let them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. Make this tabernacle and all its furnishings exactly like the patterns I will show you. So Exodus records that God himself spoke these words to Moses. And basically he said, if you want the paraphrase, build me a tent. And there's enormous detail in the book of Exodus about what this tent should look like. So we could say this is the first ever architect's brief. A simple one, I grant you. But build a dwelling place for God's own presence, where his holiness could dwell among sinful people. And when it was finished, it looked something a bit like this. And the fire that Moses and the Israelites saw on Sinai was seen in this tent. This is what the Bible records. But instead of the mountain where the Israelites were told, don't set foot on the mountain or you might die, this was a way of God's presence somehow being contained safely in the very heart of the Israelite camp. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the design of this tabernacle because it was laden with meaning. So the tabernacle was designed according to a detailed plan. You can read all about it at the end of the book of Exodus. And this refrain goes on again and again as the story of the building of the tabernacle is told. Set it up according to the plan shown on the mountain. So again and again, like any good builder, Moses and his team, there was a chap called Bezalel who was very gifted in all of the sort of craft work and fabrics and overlaying with gold and bronze that was needed. They would scurry back to the plan and check it. It's a bit like building inspection in sort of 3500 BC. Have we done it exactly right? It was important to them, as it is to us, isn't it, that the work was done really well, to the highest standards. And they had to raise lots of money and plead for extreme generosity from this nomadic tribe to create what was, amongst other things, a hugely expensive construction. Is this ringing any bells? So, it began with an outer court, which is this sort of a barrier around the outside. And the outer court, you can see there some curtains through which you could enter. So when the people of the tribes of Israel wanted to worship, this is what they did. They got up in the morning, they left their tent, and they came to the curtains of the outer court. And they brought with them either some flour or some wheat or an animal, a dove or a goat or a sheep or very occasionally a bull, to sacrifice. I mean, I only learned recently that actually this was the only way that animals were killed. Some of us might have thought that animal sacrifice is an abhorrence, but arguably they regarded animal life as a far more sacred thing than we do in our culture, Because the only way you could eat an animal in these days was to take it as an act of worship into the tabernacle, where, as we will see, don't worry, I'm not going to show you anything too gory, it was sacrificed humanely, and part of it was offered in worship. Now, I'm not suggesting we should bring back animal sacrifice, but I am saying that this act of worship combined their daily lives, even the eating of a meal, with the offering in thanksgiving of food, whether meat or flour or wheat, and oil that went with it, to God as an act of worship. Sounds very strange to our ears. We prefer to come in, open a book and read what it says inside, but this is how they did it. And the outer court was set up to mark out the boundary of the worship space. And so people could come and go through those curtains as they came to offer their worship. And when they left, if you like, they weren't worshipping any longer. They went about their normal lives. So what happens if you went through the gates? You came firstly to a bronze basin. And this basin was full of water, and it was used for ritual washing, both of the people and actually of the animals, of their sacrifices as they were made. And so this basin was just inside the curtains and would have been the first thing that people came to. And inside the courtyard, the priests did their work and helped the people to bring their sacrifice as part of their worship. Next to the basin was the altar of sacrifice, covered in bronze, inside which was kept a burning fire, and the burnt sacrifices were laid on this. So some certain parts, like the fat tail, the kidneys of the animal, would be burned as a sacrifice, and the rest would either be given to the priests for their food or taken home to be consumed. And this altar of sacrifice was, again, you can see by the curtains, one of the first things in the courtyard that people saw when they came in. So these two things, the basin and the bronze altar, were in the courtyard. But then do you remember that the tent itself, the tabernacle itself, was the next thing that you saw? And if you poked through the curtains of the tabernacle, which was made in planks that were overlaid with gold, so the outer courtyard, most of the things were bronze, like the tent pegs and the posts, the bases for the posts. When you got to the tabernacle itself, it was all gold. It was made of gold. And when you looked inside, it had a roof covered with animal hides and skins. And when you looked inside, there was a space that looked something like this. Now, the only people allowed in this bit were the priests. The people could enter the outer court, but they weren't allowed into what was called the holy place. So we have this idea of a kind of gradation of holiness in the worship space, from the doorways, from outside, and then into the outer court, and then into the holy place. And if you notice, there's a curtain at the far end that we will come to in a moment. And every day the priest would come in here, and they would tend to the objects that were in there. So in the middle, where the pointer is there, was a gold, much smaller altar where they burned incense. So incense was constantly rising. And some of you may burn incense in your churches even today. There was also a lampstand with candles on it. The menorah here, which many of you will recognize, a symbol of Judaism to this day, a 7-branch lampstand. And the priest's job was to keep those candles burning, to keep them topped up with oil, so that they burned day and night. There was also a table here with 2 piles of six pieces of unleavened bread, one for each of the 12 tribes. And every day the priest would come in and put fresh bread on the table. So this all happened in the holy place. Well, you might be thinking, I'm curious to know what's behind the curtain. So at the far end, those 2 curtains marked off the final area, which was called the most holy place. It was a cubic room where everything inside was gold, and the only person who was allowed in there was the high priest, and then only one day a year, Do you see still this idea of as you enter into the tabernacle, the level of holiness, if you like, increases and increases until you have the area that could only be entered by one person on one day of the year, and that was the Day of Atonement. You can read about it in Leviticus 16. And behind that curtain, there was the Ark of the Covenant of Indiana Jones fame. And inside the ark were the 2 tablets of stone with the 10 commandments, and also a jar of manna which they collected, and Moses' staff. And on top of the ark, there was a cover, sometimes called the mercy seat. And on there were the sculptures of 2 angels with their wings outstretched. And it was said that in the space here, between the wings of the angels, was where there was the epicenter of God's presence. So it's hard for us to imagine. This was thousands of years ago. And it seems, if you've never heard this before, you must be thinking, have I gone to sleep and am I dreaming? It's very strange, isn't it, to our modern sensibilities. But this is what the first ever, in biblical terms, the first ever construction for worship looked like. And there were people whose job it was to service this extraordinary building, which included, actually, when the camp moved, putting it all away. They had a very, very specific way of doing it, and carrying this nuclear reactor to the new campsite, and then they put it down and built it all again around it. So these are priests from the tribe of Levi. These are, if you like, the normal priests, and they had robes which are, again, specified according to the pattern on the mountain. They wore turbans, and this is the rather splendid uniform and robes of the high priest, who had an ephod, it was called, like an apron, a special turban with, obviously you can't read it, but there was a little gold plate with "Holy to the Lord" written on it. And this breastplate has 12 precious stones in it, one for each of the tribes of Israel. So he wore the names of the tribe of Israel next to his heart on these precious stones. Deeply evocative of God's holiness and love, and of the special calling of the high priest. And you can read about his clothing in Exodus, and then Leviticus. There is an account of the ordination of these priests and how they began their ministry. So all of this was created in the desert, extraordinarily, by this huge tribe of nomads, perhaps 400,000 strong, for the worship of their God. And when it was all finished, like any good building project, there was a sign-off. Here's how Exodus describes it. The Israelites had done all the work just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Moses inspected the work and saw that they'd done it just as the Lord had commanded. So Moses blessed them. There is actually a disputed verse missing from that, which said Moses inspected the work and found a long snagging list, which he then disputed with the builders for several years, and then saw that they had done it just as the Lord had commanded. But yes, some people think that text has got lost somewhere. So there we are, the first ever satisfied client of a building project, possibly. And here's a representation of what a day in the life of the tabernacle might have looked like. This strange activities going on. A butcher's shop, really, on one side. The water bath, it's actually been placed in a different place to the earlier one. We're not sure exactly where it was. The altar with burnt offering, wood, sheep and goats, a bull which would have been offered at the greatest sort of festivals of the year, and the incense rising from just in front of the curtain by the most holy place. Does that give you some sort of idea? I'm trying to put you in a time travel machine and transport you back 3,500 years to the Sinai Peninsula and how the worship in the desert happened. And when the tabernacle was commissioned, Moses prayed a prayer, and this is how the Bible describes what happened next. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. In all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out until the day it lifted. So the idea is that what characterized the Israelite tribe was God's presence. That was what made them who they were. And if the presence moved, they moved with it. And if it didn't move, they didn't move. And so sometimes it stayed for a few days, sometimes for months and months in the same place. But what was happening was the forging of an identity of a new nation around God's own presence, as mediated to them, as contained, if you like, within this extraordinary travelling tent, the tabernacle. And this is very, very different to us, isn't it, from a Book of Common Prayer, Holy Communion. And yet, it is undoubtedly part of the same long narrative. The arc of the narrative that ends with our BCP or our service as we would experience it here in St Mary's or in any of your churches on a Sunday began with this. And that's, I still find, an extraordinary thing. So, given that, I'm going to try and make a few connections between these two ends of two things that seem totally unrelated. So here's a question. How has the tabernacle influenced church design? Even the building we're sitting in now. Or if that doesn't interest you, can you identify any of these photos I'm about to show you? Does anyone know what we're sitting in now, what it's called, this largest part of the church? The nave. Does anyone know why it's called the nave? It's like a ship, as in the Navy. And if you look up in almost every church, you can imagine, I'm a sailor, so I love getting people to do this. You can almost imagine you're peering down into the bowels of a ship and seeing the planking and imagining the water rushing on the outside. You don't have to imagine very much. In the English winter, often, there is water rushing on the other side. So here is a nave. Does anyone want to tell me where that is? Not Little Missenden, but this is one for the North Bucks residents. This is All Saints Wing. Actually, one of the oldest churches in Bucks, extraordinary history there. And as it happens, with a new vicar, Don Wright, who's an expert in Saxon history, so he's happy as can be. But the nave is where people enter when they want to come and worship. As they walk through the door, they might bring with them something to offer God. It's where anyone can enter in and gather to come and worship. Does that ring any bells? The nave is effectively the outer courtyard. The font. Does anyone recognize this font? I'm a bit worried now because I'm sure there are people from this church here, and I'm wondering if the labeling on the internet is wrong. It's a St. Mary Magdalene. Great Hampden? Is this not the font from Great Hampden? It is. Good. The former vicar of Great Hampden's just nodded at me, which is a relief. If someone could nudge him and wake him up, that would be excellent. Where is the font in most churches? At the door. Where was the basin? By the door. The basin is for the cleansing of the people, the ritual washing. What is baptism, if not a form of ritual washing? The bronze altar. Now, we don't, as I've already observed, have a liturgy for the sacrifice of animals in the Church of England. But we do, at the back of church, near the font, in many churches, not all, but as the service starts, have wine and bread and sometimes a collection plate, which can be described as sacrifices or as blood, the offering of our gifts. Our financial offering, the collection, is part of our worship. The blood of Christ, symbolized in the wine that we drink at communion, is brought in many churches, not all, from near the door right into the place of worship. Interesting, isn't it? The collection and the communion elements arguably have some parallel with the sacrifices that were made. And the New Testament in Romans, Paul describes the sacrifice we make being praise and thanksgiving. And so arguably, this picture on the right symbolizes the sacrifices we bring. Not because we want to take out a direct debit and someone's got to pay for the roof repairs. No, this is part of an act of worship. And integral, interestingly, to our Christian worship. You know, in a standard communion service, there is an offertory hymn, which is when the offering is made. It would be very easy just to leave a bucket at the back and ask people to give, or to do what we've done this evening and get them to pay on the way in. But no, it's an integral part of the worship. The chancel. Anyone want to tell me where this chancel is? Sorry? Here? Oh, well, this is the chancel of this church, but that is not the chancel of this church. That is the chancel. Anyone want to guess? I should have made this easier, shouldn't I? I thought, these are the aficionados of Buckinghamshire church architecture. That is St. Peter's, Ilmer. You knew that. You're being very kind to everyone else, not flaunting your knowledge. The chancel is the space. Look at this space we're in here. You are in the outer court. It's not true, but a lot of people think it's true, that as you head east, it gets holier. And that Jesus, if he lives anywhere, actually is probably hiding under the table up there. That's what I used to think when I was a little boy. I've met many people, actually. I sometimes use a talk a bit like this to talk about prayer and how we start by entering in and being washed clean by God. And then we give a sacrifice of thanksgiving, and then we progress more and more into his presence. And I lead groups of people up the steps, and some people won't walk any further than this. They can't. It's strange, isn't it? But there is a sense in which I think in church architecture, the chancel is very deliberately patterned after the holy place. What do you often find in chancels that you also had in the holy place? A screen, a door, as in St. Peter's, Ilmer. So a curtain to go through. And very occasionally you will find churches, Woburn Green, if you know that, St. Mary's Woburn Green would be an example, incredibly ornate screen that almost completely obscures the view beyond to the congregation, just as in the holy place. Anything else you notice in there? Like these? Favourite church? Another thing people started buying me a lot when I got ordained, candles. One of my Irish friends kept buying me special Roman Catholic church candles, and it said, as authorised by the hierarchy. It said on the candles. I was quite pleased with those. I'm not sure I noticed any difference when I burnt them, but anyway, candles here and here. Bread here and brought up. Do you remember? Every day the priest would come and change the bread. Every Sunday in many churches, people will bring the bread up here into the chancel. And what else was burned in the holy place? Incense. In Revelation chapter 5, verse 8, it describes angels holding bowls of incense, and it says, which were the prayers of the saints. And many people, I'm one of them, maybe you're one of them, if we go into a church, will go into the chancel and pray. I love doing that when I'm in a church on my own. So again, more parallels. Here's another chancel. Anyone want to guess where that is? Lacy Green, very good. St. John the Evangelist, Lacy Green, just celebrated the 200th anniversary. Was anyone there? 200th. And many chancels, here my local church in St. Mark's in Bourne End, very plain church until you get to the chancel, and then it's beautiful. It's supposed to be a picture of heaven. It's supposed to evoke in us as we walk through the church and we enter towards, if you like, the holy place, the beauty of heaven, of God's presence. That's why some chancels like this one in Lacey Green are so ornately decorated. And then finally, we reach at the far east end, just as it was the east end of the tabernacle tent, we reach the sanctuary, cordoned off from the hoi polloi, where only the high priest can enter once a year. Well, of course, we don't say that. But is there not some parallel between the sanctuary, where the altar is, a rectangular shape like the ark, which sits there and symbolizes for us, if you like, the focal point of every church, just as, do you remember, the wings of the cherubim symbolize the focal point of God's presence. And in some sanctuaries, you will have the Ten Commandments stuck on stones in the wall. Very evocative of the tabernacle. Anyone want to guess which sanctuary this is? I think I'm too far south in Bucks again. It is Wolverton, very Holy Trinity Wolverton. Beautiful church if you've never been. And the altar rail, as it is in this church, is reminiscent of the curtain. And the priest enters in. Actually, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would go behind the curtain and he would tie a rope around his ankle in case he died in God's presence, and then they could haul him out. I'm not making it up. Extraordinary. We don't do that anymore. And the robed ministers. Anyone recognize this wonderful bunch of people, or any of them? Robed ministers in the sanctuary. No, not well. There is a resident of North Marston, Guy Elsmore, dearly beloved, recently retired archdeacon. But this is St Mary the Virgin, Hambledon. And this is Sue Morton and Andy Storch and organist and choir, wearing their robes. No breastplate with precious gems, I don't think. But still, where do robes come from? Quite possibly, plausibly, from these priests who ministered in the tabernacle. So do you see, we kind of take for granted the layout of churches, but they're astonishingly similar from one to another. And when you delve right back into the Bible story, there are, I think, very plausibly connections that link the shape of our buildings to our ancestors of the faith who worshipped in the desert in Moses' time and who have informed, and we can read about them in Exodus and Leviticus in particular, have informed our story and paved the way for our Christian worship. Obviously, there are huge discontinuities. We'll come on to those in a moment. But I think there's a large element of community, and for me it's fascinating to trace that family line, if you like. So I hope you found that of some interest. And now I wanted to go back to the story because, and don't worry, this is an indication of how long I'm going to be speaking for, but so far we've only reached about this far through the story. What happens next, I wonder? I tried to tell you the whole of the Old Testament in 90 seconds or so earlier. I'm going to try and tell you the rest of the Old Testament in a similarly condensed way, but looking in particular at buildings. Joshua, Judges, and Samuel. So we will assume that we've reached Moses' time in the desert with the Israelites. And in the book, if you know the next books of the Bible, after the first five are Joshua, Judges, and Samuel. And this is the story of Israel arriving from the south here in the desert and entering across the Jordan into the Promised Land and settling in it. This was a time when the nomadic tribes became settled townsfolk, when they entered into their national identity, especially expressed in the land, their covenant. They believed a promise of the land from God, a king, an independent ruler, independent of other nations, and worship based in the temple. And if you want four words that give you some account for why we have conflict in the Middle East, there they are, even to this day. And during this time, tents became buildings. And that was also true of the tent we've just been looking at, the tabernacle that traveled, or the 40 years of the traveling through the wilderness, the wandering in the wilderness with the tent. Once they entered into the promised land and they started building houses for themselves, well, someone came up with the idea, King David, how can I be living in a palace while God's own presence, the ark, is living in a tent? And so David came up with the idea, and his son Solomon oversaw the building of a building in Jerusalem which bore striking similarities to the tabernacle we've just been looking at. Now, the site of this construction is deeply evocative in the Bible story. It was the same hill where Abraham sacrificed his son Isaac. Except, if you remember, he didn't sacrifice his son Isaac. Genesis chapter 22. He looked up, and a ram, a sheep, was caught in the thicket above him by its horns. And he offered that as a sacrifice in place of his son. It was a precursor of the temple sacrifice. It was a lamb that was offered to save the life of Isaac, abhorrent as that sounds to our modern ears, though very, very common in the culture of that day. It was also, so that's if we zoom back sort of 1,000 years or so from Moses, zoom forward another 1,000 years, and this is the same hill where Jesus, who was called the Lamb of God, died on a cross and shed his blood as a sacrifice that would save and bring life. And on this hill, Solomon chose to build the temple in Jerusalem, which was built to exactly the same pattern as the tabernacle, and deliberately so. So you can see, well, there's an outer court. We'll see a bit more of that in a moment. The basin, the altar of sacrifice, the doors, this enormous and imposing building, bronze, all the articles on the outside, gold on the inside. You walk in through the great doors. You can read about it in 1 Kings 5-8. 4 whole chapters of architectural detail for any of you architect geeks out there. It gives great descriptions about the kind of flora that would be described, the pineapples, the gold chains, enormous detail, and vast quantities of gold. As you will probably know, Solomon presided over the richest time of the whole of the history of Israel. And that economic boom, fortunately, coincided with the construction of one of the most expensive, well, the most expensive building, I would think, for sure, in the world at that time. And so the priests, anyone could come into this outside court. Only the priests could go in through the door into the holy place, where there was, guess what? A gold altar of incense, a candle stand, and a table for the bread. And then into the most holy place, once a year, there was a curtain there, and the high priest could go into it. There were also so these rooms, because some of you I know love architects' plans, there were rooms for storage and for accommodation for the priests and so on included in this as well. Here's another impression of what the whole temple complex looked like. So the outer court here, all the storage rooms and so on. And then there was actually, this is the outer court here. There was a court of the Gentiles here, so only Jews were allowed into this outer court, this bit. And an inscription has been found in the archaeology from this court here, saying Gentiles can go this far but no further. And then the temple itself, this enormous imposing building surrounded by a colonnade with the king's palace next door, and you can see in this artist's impression, in the very heart of the whole city. And as many of you will know, this is the site to this day of the Wailing Wall, of the mosque in Jerusalem, and still perhaps the most contested spot of real estate on the whole of the surface of the earth. A place where for the Jews, God's presence dwelled. Now remember, when they had the tabernacle, the portable tent, it moved around all over the place. Where the cloud moved and the fire moved, they moved with it. But now, God's got an address. 1 Temple Mount, Jerusalem, Israel. And this is why it's such a big deal. And of course, there's a corresponding Muslim narrative about Muhammad's flight to heaven and so on. But for Jews, that's why this is such a big deal, because God moved in. Just like they moved out of their tents and started building houses and planting crops, God moved into the neighborhood and put down roots, and they believed would stay there forever. And when the temple was dedicated, this is the passage describing it. When Solomon finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt sacrifices, the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. Remind you of anything? Same as the tabernacle. God's presence in a building where they came to worship. And then very quickly, the story, this is the high point. The story gets worse. There's an exile described in Jeremiah when the Assyrians and Babylonians come in. They conquer Jerusalem. They destroy it. You can read about it at the end of 2 Kings and Chronicles. They destroy the temple. God's presence departs. There's a very dramatic depiction of that in the book of Ezekiel in chapter 10. And they go off to captivity by the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. They sang Psalm 137. And then they returned 70 years later from captivity. They were allowed to return under King Artaxerxes, and Ezra and Nehemiah brought some of the remnant, the rulers, like all great superpowers in those days. When they conquered a city, they moved all of the ruling classes and all of the gifted and talented, most gifted and talented leaders, and they took them out of the country so that they, if you like, decapitated the society as they saw it. But Ezra and Nehemiah were allowed to return and start rebuilding, and they built under Ezra and rededicated a second temple, much smaller, much more modest. And that was the temple that was still standing when, in Jesus' time, that was the temple that we read about in Jerusalem in the Gospels. And that stood until 70, in the year 70, when the Romans destroyed it once and for all and left, to all intents and purposes, what we see now in Jerusalem today. There is a postscript. There is a third temple described in the Bible in the end of the book of Ezekiel, and there are many Jews all around the world who are working towards rebuilding this third temple and believe that will one day stand on the Temple Mount. I'm not going there. So there we are. That is the story, if you like, the whole of the arc of the Old Testament, the story of God's presence and how it relates to first a tent and then a building and an address in Jerusalem. Finally, we reach the Christian era. Jesus and God's presence. And there are, as I've already pointed out, some great continuities, but there are also some enormous discontinuities. And I think it's important that we grasp those as we seek to serve the church buildings of Buckinghamshire. In Jesus, God's presence arrives not in a tent, not in a cloud, not in a pillar of fire, but in a person, and indeed the most vulnerable of people, a newborn baby. John's Gospel, you'll recognize this from the candlelit carol service. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. A few verses later, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling. A literal translation is tabernacled or camped among us. It's a very deliberate, in John's Gospel, not a word is wasted, a very deliberate echo of the Old Testament. God's presence arrives and camps among us, not in a carefully designed tent, but in a human being of flesh and blood, with a beating heart, with veins and eyelashes and toenails. God's presence in a person, what we call the incarnation, the enfleshment of God, the embodiment of this extraordinary and holy and fearsome God, and that's the wonder of the Christmas story, appears as a vulnerable baby gazing up at parents who love him. Jesus has some very interesting encounters with the temple building. I'm just going to summarize one here. Do you remember the scene in John chapter 2 where he creates a cord of whips and drives money changers and people who were trying to basically fleece the population by making money out of temple worship? He drives them out of the temple and says, this is a place of worship, not a place for you to make profit, not a place for you to abuse people who've come to worship by by overcharging them or using exorbitant exchange rates. And he said this at this scene, "Destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days." And they said, "How can you do that? It took decades to build this temple." But then John explains the temple he'd spoken of was his body. Because you remember when Jesus arrived, God's presence appeared not in the building, but in his body. And so that's the clearest indication of it. Jesus saying, "Destroy this temple and I will raise it in 3 days." They were thinking, "Oh my gosh, who's going to knock the building down?" He wasn't talking about the demolition of the building. He was talking about his own death on the cross and how in 3 days it would be raised again. So on the cross, as Jesus hung there with his life ebbing away, the Lamb of God sacrificed for the sins of the world, people who passed by said to him, "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." Interesting, even in that moment, they were thinking about the relationship between, this is the Son of God and the temple is meant to be where God lives? What's going on? And of course, the assumption was God's presence departs. If God's presence now dwells in this one human body, what happens when that body dies? Well, presumably, exile. God's presence departs as it did before. But actually, no. In Jesus' death, access to God's presence is opened up and not shut off. When Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit, and at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Do you remember where the curtain was in the temple? In the temple, there was only one curtain. There were 3 in the tabernacle. The temple in the curtain was the one that closed off the most holy space, the space that was so holy, so concentrated with God's presence that only the high priest could go in there, and then only once a year, and then with a rope tied around his ankle in case it overcame him and he had to be hauled out stone cold dead. That space, when Jesus died, according to Matthew's gospel, was opened up as the temple was torn in two. And perhaps also this signifies the end of the temple worship system, because a once-for-all sacrifice had just been made, and there was no longer a need to carry on offering the sacrifices of goats and sheep. The story continues, and Jesus' resurrection was confirmation that God's presence hadn't died or departed. To the contrary, it was indestructible. And then something very interesting happened. On the day of Pentecost, disciples were all gathered together. And when the day of Pentecost came, they saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit. Now, what was meant to happen with the fire of God's presence? You remember? It's concentrated in one place and is dangerous and consuming. It's like a nuclear reactor that needs to be safely contained within the tabernacle or the temple. Now, there is a column of fire over every single one of the believers. And God's presence, the Holy Spirit, fills each one of them just as the presence of God had filled Jesus as a person and not as a building. And so in the tabernacle, we see a new project. And this is how St. Paul describes it. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? Paul says if you're a Christian, you are a portable temple. Put your hand on your heart for a moment, if you'd like to. You are touching a temple. You are touching a receptacle that's been carefully designed to contain the presence of God. Imagine if you had a nuclear reactor in your heart. That's the astonishing message of the day of Pentecost. And the reason I'm saying all of this evening is to ask the question, what does this mean for our buildings? If our bodies are the new tabernacles, then what are our buildings for? If the nuclear power of God's love can be contained in a human heart, why do we still need buildings? Well, because church, by which I mean the people, is a gathering of temples. When I was little, I was taught, here is the church, here's the steeple, open the doors, and here are all the people. It's the people that are the church. And the church is a gathering of temples. The New Testament was originally written in Greek, and the word that they chose for church, ecclesia, simply means gathering. It's just a gathering. Like you would have a coffee morning is an ecclesia, a parliament is an ecclesia, a party is an ecclesia, a church is an ecclesia. What is it? It's a gathering of temples of the Holy Spirit, a collection of temples who gather in a building. So in the Old Testament, if you like, you had the temple and the tabernacle, which contained God's presence. But now the most holy place is in our hearts. God's presence is contained not in constructions of wood and stone or canvas, but in human bodies. And those bodies gather in a church building. Now, there are questions which are fascinating and beyond the scope of my talk this evening, maybe one for next year's talk, about to what extent God's presence dwells in certain places that have been prayed in for centuries or even millennia. Thin places, some people call them, where you walk in and you sense you're treading on holy ground. You know, how does God's presence still inhabit buildings? I would want to say yes. But primarily, the Bible teaches us, the New Testament teaches us, God's presence that makes its home. God makes his home in the human heart. And that means you don't have to have a building to host God's presence. As if you've ever been to an outdoor service, you will remember, if any of you were at Hartwell House for that open air evensong we did a few months ago. It was absolutely beautiful. So we don't need buildings. Indeed, we held that just outside the building that is so dangerous no one can go inside it. Didn't stop us from worshipping. So we don't, as a matter of theological sort of nicety, need buildings, but we need to gather. And that's why our church buildings matter so much to us as Christians, to me as a bishop. But an important point related to this is that the church is indestructible. This is St. Thomas Church in St. Elizabeth Parish in Jamaica. That's how it looked a month ago. That's how it looks now. The General Secretary of the Jamaica Baptist Union, Reverend Merlin Hyde Riley, told his people, "Our churches aren't just worship centres. They run schools, clinics, homework programs and kitchens that feed the homeless. With roofs gone and equipment destroyed, those ministries are temporarily halted. It's heartbreaking, but we don't believe this is permanent." That building, I'm no expert. I would venture to say that building is permanently destroyed. But the church is not permanently destroyed. St. George's Anglican Church in Westmoreland has also lost its roof. Reverend Harley Perrin is due to retire this year after 47 years in ministry. He said, "I feel confident that the church can be rebuilt. I've done it over and over, but I'm an old man now. This time, it will be up to those who come after me to rebuild." Isn't that a wonderful thing to say when the church you've worshipped in for your whole life has just been flattened by a hurricane? Oh, we can rebuild. Not in my lifetime, maybe, but it will rebuild. And this is the point I'm trying to communicate about God's presence and the church and the buildings, is that the church, if you like, is indestructible, but it's also seems to be permanent. though it's always changing. It's a bit like the curve of a waterfall. C.S. Lewis used this analogy. You look at the curve of a waterfall and it seems static, permanent, solid. But in fact, it's constantly changing. There are lots of things like this. Your body is like this. The cells are constantly being renewed. There's not a single cell in your body that was there when you were born and is still there now. And yet you are the same you. Churches are the same. Our buildings, in some ways, are the same. They're constantly changing, even as they're signs of permanence and stability. And this, my friends, is why I think we're here. Because church buildings will always be rebuilt, reopened, and renewed. Here's one final quiz for you. I'm just about to finish. But over the past decade, the Church of England in Buckinghamshire has closed how many churches, do you think? Have a guess. 20? 7? Hands up if you think it's more than 20. Hands up between 10 and 20. How many less than 10? How many less than 5? How many less than 3? 2. 2 churches closed. Both of them by the unanimous request of the local people, the villagers, the PCC. I'm sorry to break it to you, bishops have no power to close churches. It's about the hardest thing there is to do in the Church of England, apart from getting people to sit in the front row, perhaps. In the same period, we have opened, anyone want to guess? 9. Interesting, isn't it? I'm not saying churches don't close. I'm not saying there isn't decay and decline. But the overall picture is of renewal. Why? Because the church is an enormous collection of human hearts who gather together and are renewed by God's presence. That's the understanding for Christians of church. And that's why the Historic Churches Trust is such a gift. It's been supporting this constant renewal of the church since 1957. Has given over £1 million towards preserving wonderful buildings like this so that they can go on being the beating heart at the centre of their community. We give away £60,000 per year. And it's not just Anglican churches, I'm an Anglican bishop, but all denominations apply to and benefit from the fund. So if you'd like to become a friend, if you'd like to attend events, if you'd like to join the trustees and play a small part, as each of us can, in the renewal of this extraordinary architectural heritage that contains the holy presence of God in the hearts of his people, then please do visit the website, pick up a friend's leaflet, and do something with it today. It's been a real honour to be invited to be a trustee of the Historic Churches Trust and to be here with you this evening. Thank you for your attention. I don't know if any of you want to ask any questions, but if you do, now is your opportunity.
If anyone would like to ask a question, the microphone's here, so raise your hand and you'll get to the microphone. Is that all?
No.
There we are.
Thank you. Obviously, a little while after the curtain in the temple split and was rent asunder, there was a move, and I'm thinking particularly within the church in England, but maybe elsewhere, that we started taking down screens and allowing people into the chancel, the sanctuary sometimes, to take part in services. I don't know the history of that, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the background to that.
Do you want a short answer or a long answer? Short answer is no. As I said, I'm not an expert. I do know that certainly, I think around the time of the Reformation, there was a lot of rethinking about the divide between clerics and lay people. You don't need to speak Latin to host God's presence, but for example. And I also know, the village church where I grew up had a screen put in when most people had just been taking them all out. So I don't think it's a simple picture, but I think it is connected with the way we view God's presence. And at its worst, clericalism before the Reformation and now consists of priests not being servants, but gatekeepers, not helping people into worship, but excluding them. And we can do that in all kinds of ways, me and my colleagues, being unfriendly to people who want to come and get married, etc., etc. Or shutting the doors physically to the chancel. And I think, for me, that's what interests me today, is how we can make sure that our buildings resonate with our desire to be welcoming, open, and assist people in drawing near to God rather than holding them at arm's length. I'm not sure that's answered the question.
Made me happy.
Is there anyone who knows a lot more than I do about screens, about rood screens? Who could answer? No.
Any other questions?
Thank you for that, Dave. That was I wasn't quite sure what to expect when I saw what the title was for tonight's talk, and that was a fascinating hour, so thank you. I asked this question in some trepidation, given the organisation under whose auspices we're all here this evening, but you touched on the difficulties about closing churches, and from my deanery chairing days, I remember just how painful a process that is. Do you think it should be easier
To close churches?
to close churches, given the diversion of funds and human energy and other things that go into the maintenance of some of our buildings? And I'm thinking in particular, I think of the case that was the one where I was involved over a number of years, a building that was unsafe to enter, no running water. Its electrical supply had to be cut off because it was dangerous. You had a building that eventually had to be fenced off from all its surroundings, and which church authorities in the end agreed really needed to be closed, but which in the end couldn't be because of a sort of local backlash of non-worshippers, non-participants in that church who didn't want to lose an attractive ancient structure from the settlement. I just wonder, I'm not necessarily landing it in the lap of the bishops, but do you think it should be an easier process to conduct?
I remember hearing a football pundit talk to a footballer in his 30s who was talking about retirement and saying to him, "You're retired for a very, very long time. So if you're not sure, don't retire too early." And I kind of think once you close a church, it's going to be closed for a very, very long time. And if there's any possibility of resurrection, then it's best to leave it as long as possible. At the same time, I have huge compassion for people who are working their socks off to look after an ancient building that no one's coming to worship in anymore. And I think we need to hold on to both of those things, somehow relieve the suffering of people. And sometimes it's an emotional suffering of, I've lived and worshipped in this village all my life. My parents were married in this church. My grandparents are married in this church. They're buried in the churchyard. I can't bear to see it closed. That's a huge burden for people to carry. So I'm not really going to answer your question, I don't think, because I'm not sure it would, if we cared better for those people, I'm not sure we would need to close. I think a lot of the need to close a church is because it's such a burden on people. And I think there are other ways of sharing burdens. And we look very hard at other groups, setting up CIOs, National Trust, festival churches. There are lots of other ways of dealing with a church that isn't regularly being used for worship anymore before you get to closing it.
Again, thank you very much for your talk. It was really interesting. And I just wondered if you had a view on whether the state should have much more investment in the maintenance of our historic churches.
Great question. Are you asking because you have in mind other models from other countries where that is the case?
No, I'm asking because it's a huge burden on a relatively small worshipping congregation to maintain a lot of these buildings.
Yeah. I'm going to be more decisive this one and say I think the answer is no, because there are, in Scandinavia, for example, the government maintains church buildings in a way that doesn't happen here in Germany. There's a lot more public funding of worship. And to me, what do I know? But I think on balance, you lose more than you gain. There's a short financial benefit, but a very long cost in other ways. I'm quite a fan of churches finding new ways to be at the heart of their community. Many churches, for example, I'm going to really offend some people here, have pews put in, after centuries of the church being the main meeting place in the community. And then they had to build a church hall next to it because they couldn't meet in the church anymore. And then you've got two old buildings to look after. And now, Stadhampton would be an example near here of a small village church that cleared the pews out, put in underfloor heating, a kitchen, very, very well done and discreetly done. You can walk in there and it can feel like we're in the Middle Ages. You can also walk in there and see the Cubs or the Brownies meeting because it's become the heart of village life again. And I think that's a better way forward than just trying to get money to lock churches in as they are now. I think we always need to ask ourselves, it's the big debate, isn't it? What's conservation rather than preservation? And let the waterfall keep renewing while retaining the beauty and the feel of our old buildings. I'd like to know what you think.
Misunderstood that. I think you misunderstood that I was aiming for preservation. I'm totally 100% with you in terms of changing buildings to reflect new purposes. So, yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that comes with public money, inevitably, and there's no judgment, but it is a lack of understanding of the core purpose of churches, and so I think you inevitably end up towards preservation. And the amenity societies are an example of that. Their job is to say, no, we can't blame them for that. They don't really have any benefit very much. And I'm not trying to offend anyone. I'm sure there'll be people who are involved in them. But, they are there to preserve, to make sure we don't throw away this heritage. And I think that as a church, I would love us to not give up the battle of trying to resource the continual renewal of our buildings rather than leaning on or turning to the public purse, which after all is pretty stretched as well as a nation, isn't it? I wouldn't want to make the case for more church repairs rather than new hospitals or schools or palliative care.
I may just add a comment. Spending a lot of time in France, I know their churches get matched fundings for whatever you can raise, and it has made a dramatic difference to a number of country churches, which are now open for all sorts of other purposes as well. So it can act as kindling to get the village going again. That's just a personal comment.
Well, I'm not a buildings expert, but I was in the south of France this summer and couldn't help reflecting as I cycled through all these villages that perpetual sunshine and 20 degrees probably helps keep churches open for longer as well.
They don't all have permanent sunshine. Yep.
I completely agree with everything you've said this evening. I think that the church is the people, and I love churches. I've made it my mission in the next few years to try and visit every church in Buckinghamshire, which is why I knew that that was Ilma, because I happen to cycle there in the summer. And a church for me is, whenever I go somewhere, it is the church I head for. What I would say is that in my experience over the last 2 or 3 years being on a PCC, is that a lot of rural churches, and I come from Bledlow with Saunderton and Horsenden, and before I arrived, the pews were taken out, underfloor heating was put down, and this is in Bledlow, and it's a wonderful space, and we're using it as much as we possibly can. That said, there are always things that need doing in old churches, and I do personally think that the faculty process needs reviewing, because our PCC meetings quite often end up focusing more on finance and fabric than on worship, which is our core purpose. And if there's anything you can do to help with that, I would be eternally grateful, because I really do strongly believe that it's a very long process. And whilst we want to retain the character of old buildings, these were built at times. What I'm trying to say is that there are new ways of doing things now. We don't have to always, I personally think, and I'm probably going to be offending some people as well, but I'm not suggesting that you completely change it, but I do think there are other ways of doing things that must mean that we can keep these churches going in a way that's not quite so onerous on a small congregation.
Yeah. Well, that is the heart cry of many a village church PCC, isn't it? And, you know, I was a parish vicar until 5 minutes ago, in Marlow for 13 years before becoming bishop. So, absolutely. And, attempts are being made. I mean, one of our associate archdeacons, Daniel, is sitting back there, who has authority to sign off List B faculties, they're called. There's a long and growing list of things that you just don't have to go through all of that anymore. But, yeah, I agree. And I'm sure you know, the reason there is such a process is that we've been entrusted with the care of our churches rather than have to go through the secular planning process. So that's always a consideration. But I would encourage you also to become a bishop, because there are 288 churches, Anglican churches in Bucks, and I've visited 92 of them so far. So if you enjoy visiting churches, it's absolutely brilliant job. Yeah.
Anyone else? No? Okay. Just remains for me to thank you very much indeed for an interesting talk. I noticed, or was slightly alarmed, when you started saying that there was a nuclear reactor in each of the churches, and I thought, how do we explain that to our insurance company? And what might their reaction be? But we then went on to the nuclear reactor being in us personally, and the way we come to churches and work and worship in churches. That it's still very nice to have places like this where we come and worship. And so I do encourage you to support the Friends, get another plug in, which raises funds to help maintain these churches that we love. And there's a little thing, if someone from the back can bring it up, if we can present you with that.
That's very unnecessary, very kind. Thank you. Thank you, Nick. Thank you so much. Can we give a round of applause to Nick and David and the team who've organised the whole evening for us so beautifully as well? Thank you.